On the evening of March 12, 1981, a cold, damp wind swept through the monumental heart of Washington, D.C., a city on the knife's edge of a renewed Cold War. Inside the monolithic J. Edgar Hoover Building, a fortress of concrete and authority on Pennsylvania Avenue, the fluorescent lights hummed with a sterile indifference. At approximately 8:47 p.m., a man named Richard Coleman walked through its imposing doors. He was 44 years old, an unremarkable mid-level analyst, a face you would pass on the street and instantly forget. But the briefcase he carried in his white-knuckled grip was anything but unremarkable. It was a Trojan horse, built not to breach the walls of a city, but the foundations of his own family. It contained the meticulously gathered proof of a devastating betrayal, evidence that would dismantle his life, atom by atom, in the name of national security. Inside that leather case, nestled between his uneaten lunch and a copy of the Washington Post, were photographs of classified documents, letters penned in a coded Russian script he could not read but whose purpose he understood with sickening clarity, and a small notebook filled with his wife's familiar handwriting, a script he had seen on countless grocery lists and birthday cards, now repurposed to serve the interests of a hostile foreign power. He was not just an informant. He was a husband turning in his wife, a father about to make his children motherless in all but the biological sense. He was walking into the heart of American law enforcement to confess a crime that was not his own, but whose consequences he would bear for the rest of his days. This is not simply a story of Cold War espionage, of microdots and dead drops in misty parks. Those are merely the mechanics of the tale. The true story is about the devastating physics of betrayal and the impossible calculus of loyalty. It is a story that poses a brutal question. What does a man do when his most sacred duties, duty to his country and duty to his family, are in direct, irreconcilable conflict? What happens when the front line of the Cold War isn't in the Fulda Gap in Germany or the streets of East Berlin, but in the upstairs closet of a two-story colonial in Arlington, Virginia? Our central thesis is this: the greatest tragedies of espionage are rarely the secrets that are stolen, but the lives that are shattered in the process. The story of the Coleman family reveals a truth more profound than any classified document Margaret Coleman ever photographed. It proves that a lie, even one crafted from a place of profound love and a desperate need to protect, can become a prison more confining than any federal penitentiary. It is a chronicle of a family fractured not once, but twice. First by an act of treason, and then again by the devastating, well-intentioned deception designed to conceal it. This is the story of how Richard Coleman, in a desperate attempt to save his children from the truth, ended up sacrificing their trust, and in doing so became a casualty of the very war he was trying to fight. To understand the weight of the briefcase Richard carried that night, we must first understand the world he inhabited. The year 1981 was not a time of détente and peaceful coexistence. It was the dawn of the Reagan era, a period of renewed ideological confrontation. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was in its second year. The Polish Solidarity movement was a beacon of defiance behind the Iron Curtain, and the new American president was speaking of the Soviet Union in stark, uncompromising terms, famously branding it an evil empire. This wasn't just political rhetoric. It was a psychological reality that permeated American life, especially in Washington, D.C. The threat was palpable, the enemy was monolithic, and the concept of duty was etched in sharp relief. For a man like Richard Coleman, a career government employee who had passed multiple security clearances and sat through briefings on the dangers of foreign intelligence operations, this context was not abstract. It was the air he breathed. His work at the Department of Commerce, seemingly mundane, dealt with the sinews of economic power, trade policy, resource allocation, grain exports. These were not merely numbers on a spreadsheet. They were levers of geopolitical influence, tools in the great game between superpowers. A report on grain exports to Eastern Europe which might seem innocuous to the layman, could reveal strategic vulnerabilities, economic dependencies, and political intentions to an adversary. Richard understood this. He understood that information was a weapon, and that his office, his home, his very life were all potential battlegrounds. So when he sat across from a young, stone-faced FBI agent named David Thornton, laying out his evidence with the detached precision of the analyst he was not just a husband reporting a wife. He was a soldier reporting a breach in the line. He presented the photographs, the coded letters, the surveillance logs he had painstakingly compiled over 6 agonizing weeks. He spoke in a calm, methodical monotone that belied the emotional cataclysm raging within him. Agent Thornton, in his declassified debriefing memo, would later note Richard's composure, his insistence on 2 non-negotiable points. First, that his wife, Margaret, must be arrested immediately. And second, that his 3 children, Jennifer, age 13, Michael, 11, and Sarah, 8, could never, under any circumstances, know the truth. This second demand transformed a standard counterintelligence case into a profound ethical dilemma for the Bureau. Richard wasn't just asking for discretion, he was asking for active complicity in a grand deception. He had a plan, a story so elaborate and heartbreaking that it could only have been born from absolute desperation. He would tell his children their mother had an aggressive, rare form of cancer. She had to leave immediately for a specialized, long-term treatment facility in a distant state, a place where visits were impossible due to her compromised immune system. He wasn't just inventing a disease. He was inventing a new reality for his children, a narrative of sickness and tragic separation that would, in his mind, be less damaging than the incomprehensible truth of their mother's treason. He was asking the FBI, an institution dedicated to uncovering facts, to help him build and maintain a fortress of lies around the people he loved most. The decision to accommodate his request would travel up the chain of command, a testament to the uniquely tragic and unprecedented nature of the situation. It was a recognition that the Coleman children were not just witnesses or family members of a suspect, they were victims, and the Bureau, for once, felt a moral obligation to mitigate the collateral damage of its own investigation. By the time Richard Coleman left the J. Edgar Hoover building 3 hours after he arrived, the wheels of justice were turning. But so too were the wheels of a fabrication that would define his family for decades to come. The first domino had been pushed, setting in motion a chain of events that would raise profound questions about the nature of truth, the ethics of protection, and the true cost of a secret war fought in the shadows of American suburbia. Before the floorboard was pried loose, before the cold metal box saw the light of day, there was a myth. It was the myth of the Coleman family of Arlington, Virginia, a picture-perfect diorama of the American dream circa 1981. They lived in a handsome 2-story colonial on a quiet, tree-lined street, the kind of neighborhood where the rhythms of life were dictated by the school bus schedule and the drone of lawnmowers on a Saturday morning. It was a place where families knew each other's names, where children played kick the can under the warm glow of streetlights, their silhouettes flickering in the twilight until a parent's call from a distant porch signaled the end of the day. This was the myth of normalcy, a carefully constructed stage set for a life that was anything but. At the center of this idyllic scene were Richard and Margaret Coleman. To the outside world, they were the quintessential dual-income couple of the nascent Reagan era, navigating the complex choreography of work, school, and childcare with a quiet competence. Richard was the steady provider, a mid-level analyst at the Department of Commerce. His job, though it came with a security clearance, was seen as respectable but not glamorous. He was a creature of habit, a man who left for work at the same time every morning and returned at the same time every evening, his briefcase a symbol of his dependable, bureaucratic existence. He was, by all accounts, a good father and a devoted husband, a man whose interior life seemed as orderly and predictable as the government reports he analyzed. Margaret was the artistic and nurturing heart of the home. She too worked at Commerce, but only 3 days a week. having scaled back her full-time position as an administrative assistant to raise their children. On her days off, the house would fill with the gentle, cascading notes of a piano. She was a gifted musician who taught lessons from their living room. Her students a rotating cast of neighborhood children who would arrive with their lesson books and leave with a newfound appreciation for Chopin or Bach. She was the mother who baked cookies for the school bake sale, the neighbor who always had a kind word, the wife who seemed perfectly content in her suburban life. She was intelligent, graceful, and, to all who knew her, utterly trustworthy. Together, they raised 3 children who were reflections of this constructed reality. Jennifer, the eldest at 13, was bright and responsible, already showing the focus and ambition that would later define her. Michael, 11, was the inquisitive one, a boy with a mind for mechanics, perpetually taking things apart to see how they worked. And Sarah, the youngest at 8, was the quiet observer, the sensitive soul of the family. They were good kids, products of a stable and loving home, blissfully unaware that the foundation of that home was built on a fault line of deceit. This myth of the ordinary American family was not just a facade for the neighbors. It was, for Richard, the absolute truth. Their life was a collection of unremarkable, cherished moments. Family dinners filled with chatter about school and science projects, arguments over whose turn it was to take out the trash, weekends spent doing yard work or visiting museums on the National Mall. Their love story had begun in the most conventional of ways. They met as young employees at the same government department in 1965, a classic workplace romance that blossomed over shared lunches and after-work drinks. Richard had been drawn to her intelligence, her quiet confidence, and her passion for music, which offered a vibrant counterpoint to his own more structured, analytical world. He saw in her a partner, a co-creator of the life he had always envisioned. The antagonist in this story, then, was not a person. It was not a shadowy KGB handler lurking in an alleyway. The antagonist was the secret itself, an invisible, corrosive agent that was silently metastasizing within the walls of their home. It was the vast, unknowable chasm between the life Richard believed they were living and the one Margaret was actually leading. The stakes were everything he held dear: his marriage, his children's innocence, his own sense of reality. He was living inside a carefully curated illusion, and the strength of that illusion was precisely what made the eventual truth so cataclysmic. To understand how this illusion was maintained, one must understand the unique ecosystem of suburban Washington, D.C. in the Cold War. Arlington, just across the Potomac River from the capital, was more than just a suburb. It was a bedroom community for the federal government, a place densely populated with civil servants, military officers, and intelligence personnel. Secrecy was a part of the local culture. Neighbors might work at the Pentagon, the State Department, or the CIA, but conversations at neighborhood barbecues rarely strayed into the specifics of their work. The phrase, "I have a security clearance," was a common and effective conversation stopper. This culture of discretion, this tacit agreement not to pry too deeply, created the perfect camouflage for espionage. A spy didn't need to be a femme fatale in a trench coat. She could be a piano teacher who drove a station wagon. In a world where everyone had secrets of a sort, a truly monumental secret could hide in plain sight. Margaret Coleman exploited this environment with masterful skill. Her life was a study in compartmentalization. The administrative tasks she performed at the Department of Commerce, which seemed so mundane, gave her legitimate access to a river of information. Memos, briefing papers, and policy assessments flowed across her desk daily. She was a trusted node in the network, a gatekeeper of the very kind of bureaucratic intelligence that, when aggregated and analyzed by a foreign power, could provide a detailed blueprint of American economic strategy. Her professional life was one vector of her espionage. Her domestic life was the other. Her marriage to Richard, a man with his own, higher-level access to sensitive analysis, was an intelligence goldmine. It wasn't just his security clearance that was valuable, it was his trust. The casual, almost sacred trust of a long-term marriage. The unquestioning belief that the person you share your life with is who they say they are. Richard, like any dedicated professional, would sometimes bring his work home. A briefcase left on the desk in his study overnight, filled with reports he needed to review, was not a security risk in his mind. It was his home. It was his sanctuary. He could not have conceived that the woman he loved, the mother of his children, would wait until the house was dark and silent, until he was asleep beside her, to slip downstairs and meticulously photograph those documents with a miniature camera supplied by her handlers. The betrayal was not just of his country. It was a violation of the most intimate trust a human being can place in another. The antagonist wasn't just a secret. It was a ghost living in their house, a second, hidden Margaret, who operated under the cover of darkness, a specter of whom Richard had no knowledge, but whose presence defined the ultimate reality of their lives. For 16 years, this myth held. For 16 years, the foundation remained solid. But on January 28, 1981, a simple case of the flu would introduce the first tremor, a crack in the facade that would soon bring the entire structure crashing down. Every catastrophic failure begins with a small, almost imperceptible deviation from the norm. For Richard Coleman, that deviation occurred on the afternoon of January 28, 1981. He came home from work early, around 2:30, nursing what he would later describe as flu-like symptoms. It was a simple, mundane event, the kind that happens in any family. But it was this random disruption of routine that set the first domino tilting. As his car crunched up the gravel driveway, the sound, earlier than expected, acted as an alarm bell inside the house. Margaret came down the stairs to greet him, but her movements were, in Richard's later recollection, too quick, her expression too flustered. A faint flush colored her cheeks, and an unusual nervousness flickered in her eyes. At the time, preoccupied with his own discomfort, he didn't dwell on it. He assumed she had been startled by his early return. He went to lie down in the guest room, and the incident might have dissolved into the fog of forgotten domestic moments, had it not been for what he discovered the following morning. In their master bedroom closet, a place of shared intimacy and daily routine, there had always been a minor flaw. A single floorboard near the back wall had never sat quite flush with the others. It was one of those small household imperfections that Richard had been meaning to fix for months, a task perpetually relegated to the bottom of his to-do list. On the morning of January 29th, as he reached for a pair of shoes, he noticed the board was sticking up more than usual, its edge a sharp, unfamiliar line in the dim light of the closet. Curiosity, or perhaps the instinct of a man whose mind was trained to notice anomalies, took over. He knelt, worked his fingers under the edge, and pried the board up. The wood groaned in protest, and beneath it, nestled in the dark, dusty space between the floor joists, was a rectangular metal box. It was cool to the touch, heavy, and utterly alien. The act of opening that box was the inciting incident of Richard Coleman's new life. It was the moment the myth of his marriage was irrevocably shattered. The moment the curtain was torn away to reveal the cold, terrifying machinery operating behind the scenes. The contents, which he would later document with the dispassionate precision of a coroner, constituted a complete kit for a low-level spy. There were 23 photographs, taken in poor light with what was clearly a small, concealable camera. He recognized some of the documents instantly. They were trade analysis reports from his own division at the Department of Commerce, some of which he himself had authored. The sight of his own work, his own words, miniaturized and captured on film for an enemy government, must have felt like a physical blow. Others were internal memoranda and briefing papers from different offices, documents Margaret would have handled as part of her administrative duties. Her access, he now realized, was a web, and he had been caught in it just as surely as the U.S. government. Alongside the photographs were 4 letters written in Russian, their Cyrillic characters forming patterns of code that were indecipherable to him but whose intent was perfectly clear. There were receipts from a photo development shop in Georgetown, a trendy neighborhood far from their Arlington suburb, a deliberate choice to avoid local connections. The dates on the receipts created a timeline of betrayal, stretching back nearly a year. And finally, there was a small 3x5-inch notebook, its pages filled with columns of numbers and abbreviations. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like nonsense. To a man with Richard's background, and to the cryptographers who would later analyze it, it was obviously a basic substitution cipher, a key to translating her clandestine communications. In that moment, Richard Coleman faced a choice that would define him. The visceral, human impulse would have been to confront Margaret, to demand an explanation, to unleash a storm of anger and hurt. But Richard was not a man ruled by impulse. He was an analyst. His entire professional life was dedicated to the calm, methodical gathering and interpretation of data. And so, in the face of the ultimate emotional crisis, he reverted to his training. He did not yell. He did not accuse. He placed every item back in the box, fitted the floorboard back into place, and began to operate. He understood that a simple accusation would be met with denial. Her word against his. He needed more. He needed irrefutable, undeniable proof. He needed to understand the scope of the operation. He had discovered a disease festering in his home, and his response was not to recoil in horror, but to begin a forensic investigation. This decision marks a crucial psychological turning point. Richard transformed from a husband into a counterintelligence officer, and his own home became an active surveillance target. His first move was to document the evidence. He took his own 35mm camera, a Canon AE-1 he normally used for capturing birthdays and family vacations, and photographed every single item in the box. He shot 2 full rolls of film, his hands steady, his focus absolute. He took the film to a different processing lab in a different town, paid in cash, and gave a false name. He was already learning the tradecraft of his wife's world. The prints, when he retrieved them, became the cornerstone of his case file, which he stored in a locked drawer at his office, the one place he knew was safe from her reach. He then initiated a surveillance routine that was as disciplined as it was heartbreaking. Every few days, he would check the contents of the box, noting any changes in a secret log. On February 7th, his log showed 3 new photographs had appeared. One was a report on grain export policies to the Soviet bloc. He felt a wave of nausea as he recognized it. It was a document he had brought home from the office 2 weeks prior, leaving it in his briefcase on his study desk. The realization was sickeningly intimate. She hadn't just been stealing from the U.S. government. She had been stealing from him. She had violated the sanctity of his study, rifling through his personal belongings while he slept, transforming an act of professional diligence into an opportunity for espionage. The line between his work life and his home life, which he had always thought was absolute, had been a permeable, meaningless fiction. This discovery deepened his resolve and widened the scope of his secret investigation. He began to observe Margaret not as his wife, but as a subject. He was conducting an autopsy on his own marriage, looking for the telltale signs of deception he had missed for years. He noticed patterns that had once been invisible: her habit of checking the mail the moment it arrived, lingering by the roadside a moment too long, the brief, hushed phone calls from the kitchen that would end abruptly if he walked into the room. And most significantly, her errands. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, her non-work days, she would leave the house between 7:15 and 8:45 p.m., claiming a trip to the grocery store, the pharmacy, or a friend's house. These absences, once unremarkable parts of their domestic routine, now seemed glaringly suspicious. The turning point was no longer just the discovery of a box, it was the dawning, horrifying realization that his entire perception of the woman he had loved for 16 years was a lie. The familiar landscape of his life was now an alien territory, and he was forced to navigate it alone, in secret, gathering the evidence that would ultimately lead him to the door of the FBI. Richard Coleman's 6-week clandestine investigation into his own wife was a masterclass in amateur counter-surveillance, driven by the cold fury of betrayal and the methodical precision of a trained analyst. It was an autopsy conducted on a living marriage, a forensic examination of routines and habits that had once spelled comfort, but now screamed conspiracy. He began following her. On the evening of February 2nd, a Tuesday, Margaret left the house at 7:23 p.m., announcing she was going to the grocery store. Richard waited 3 minutes, a calculated delay to avoid suspicion, and then followed in his own car, keeping a careful distance, his headlights lost among the dozens of others on the road. Her destination was not the grocery store. She drove to Potomac Park, a sprawling green space along the river, a place of joggers and tourists by day, but quiet and sparsely populated by night. He watched from a distance as she parked, walked to a specific bench overlooking the water, and sat down. For exactly 20 minutes she sat there. She did not meet anyone. She did not speak to anyone. She simply sat, a solitary figure under the park lights, before standing up, returning to her car, and making a brief stop at a 7-Eleven to purchase milk and bread. It was a perfect piece of tradecraft, a legitimate reason for her absence, a receipt to prove it, an alibi, and a carton of milk. Richard documented this pattern repeatedly throughout February. Always a Tuesday or a Thursday. Always the same park, the same bench. Always a 20-minute duration. The consistency was that of a professional. This wasn't a lover's tryst. It was an operational procedure. He began arriving at the park before her, positioning himself with a pair of binoculars he'd borrowed from a colleague, claiming a sudden interest in bird watching. He observed her closely, noticing a crucial detail. She always placed her purse on the left side of the bench. Never in her lap, never on her right. It was a signal. In the world of espionage, such seemingly insignificant details are the language of conspiracy, a way of communicating status. The package has been dropped. The coast is clear. I am ready for pickup, without uttering a single word. The breakthrough came on February 26th. Arriving 2 hours early, Richard watched as a man in a dark coat and hat approached the designated bench. The man sat for less than 3 minutes, seemingly reading a newspaper. He then folded the paper, left it on the bench, and walked away. 10 minutes later, a jogger, another cutout in the operational chain, paused his run, sat on the bench, picked up the newspaper as if it were casually discarded trash, and continued on his way. When Margaret arrived at 7:27 p.m., the bench was empty. She sat, placed her purse on the left side, and waited her customary 20 minutes. When she left, Richard noted from his vantage point that her purse seemed slightly less full. He had just witnessed a classic dead drop, a textbook method for passing intelligence without any direct contact between the agent and their handler. The scene, clinical and impersonal, confirmed his worst fears. This was not the work of a frightened, coerced amateur. This was a functioning, disciplined intelligence operation happening just miles from his home. The investigation reached its chilling climax on the night of March 3rd. Expanding his search beyond the bedroom closet, Richard feigned sleep on the living room couch. Just before midnight, he watched through slitted eyes as Margaret crept downstairs, checked on him, and then disappeared into the basement. 15 minutes after she returned to bed, he followed. The basement was a damp, unfinished space, a repository for forgotten things. Behind a stack of old paint cans, he found a small canvas bag. The contents made his hands tremble. Inside was a complete escape kit. A second set of identification documents featuring Margaret's photograph under the name Elaine Warner. A road map of the Washington area with several locations marked, and $500 in cash. This was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. This was her go bag, her exit strategy. The discovery of the first box had revealed her betrayal of their country. The discovery of this bag revealed her ultimate betrayal of their family. She had a plan to disappear, to leave him and the children behind. In that dark basement, surrounded by the detritus of their shared life, the full scope of her deception crashed down upon him. He thought back to their entire 16-year marriage, re-examining every memory through this new, horrific lens. Had their meeting been an accident, or had he been targeted from the start? A stable government employee with a promising career and access to classified information, he was the perfect target. Had the births of their children, the most profound moments of his life, been genuine expressions of love, or were they merely strategic moves to deepen her cover, to embed herself more firmly into the fabric of American life? Was he a husband, or was he a host organism for a parasite? The questions were a form of psychological torture, unanswerable and endless. By March 10th, his investigation was complete. The domino of his decision-making was now teetering on its final edge. He had the photographs, the surveillance log, the evidence from the basement. He had a case that would be impossible to refute. But the ripple effect of what he was about to do terrified him. Reporting Margaret would mean her arrest, a public trial, and a lifetime of stigma for his children. They would forever be the children of a Soviet spy. The shame, the questions, the suspicion, it would follow them through schools, friendships, and future careers. He saw their innocence as a fragile thing that would be shattered by the brute force of the truth. But not reporting her was an equal, if not greater, betrayal. It would make him complicit. Every day he remained silent, more information could be passed, more damage could be done. His silence would be a betrayal of his oath, his colleagues, and his country. He was trapped in an impossible ethical bind, a zero-sum game where every choice led to ruin. It was out of this crucible of agony that his terrible, elegant, and ultimately catastrophic plan was born. He would fulfill both duties. He would report her to the FBI, satisfying his duty to his country, and he would construct an elaborate fiction to shield his children, satisfying what he saw as his duty as a father. The cancer story was his solution. It was a narrative that explained her sudden, indefinite absence. It allowed for a controlled, supervised goodbye visit. It allowed the children to grieve their mother in a socially acceptable way, to elicit sympathy rather than suspicion. It was a lie designed as a shield. On March 14th, 2 days after his visit to the FBI, the plan was set in motion. At 6:47 a.m., federal agents entered the home Richard had left unlocked. They arrested Margaret in the kitchen as she made coffee. Her only words upon seeing her husband were, "You found it." There was no surprise, only resignation. The children slept upstairs, oblivious. Later that day, Richard gathered them in the living room and delivered the performance of his life. He spoke of cancer, of a special hospital, of experimental treatments. He had researched medical terminology at the library to make the lie plausible. He showed them pamphlets. He spoke with a father's grave authority, and they, having no reason to doubt him, believed him completely. The ripple effect had begun. The first wave was Margaret's arrest and removal. The second, and far more powerful wave, was the lie. Margaret Coleman pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. In court, she claimed she was recruited, then coerced, trapped by threats against her family. Whether this was the whole truth or a self-serving mitigation, it hardly mattered. She disappeared from the world into the federal prison system. But back in Arlington, Richard ensured she did not disappear from their home. He kept her piano in the living room. He kept her photos on the walls. He spoke of her in the present tense, a constant, absent presence. The lie became the new foundation of their family, a foundation built on quicksand. He had traded a horrific truth for a comforting lie, believing he was protecting his children. But what he had actually done was postpone the detonation, ensuring that when the truth finally did emerge, the explosion would be infinitely more powerful, and the fallout would land directly on the children he had tried so desperately to save. For 6 years, the lie held. Richard Coleman became a master of its maintenance, a solitary architect of a false reality. He was, in effect, both father and mother, warden and protector. He navigated parent-teacher conferences, school plays, and adolescent crises, all while carrying the immense weight of his secret. To the outside world, he was a tragic figure, a devoted husband bravely raising 3 children while his wife battled a terrible illness. He perfected the role, deflecting intrusive questions from well-meaning neighbors with vague, somber updates about Margaret's treatment. And he was a man living a double life, just as his wife had. But his deception was forged not from ideology or greed, but from a misguided, paternalistic love. The children, meanwhile, adapted as children do, with a resilience that is both heartbreaking and profound. They compartmentalized their grief, processing the absence of their mother through the lens their father had provided. Jennifer, the eldest, channeled her confusion into academic excellence, becoming a model student and student council president. It was a search for order in a world that felt chaotic. Michael, the tinkerer, focused his energy on the concrete world of machines, taking apart radios and computers, seeking solace in systems that had clear rules and could be put back together again. If his family was broken, he would fix what he could. Sarah, the youngest, bore the quietest and perhaps deepest wounds. She retreated inward, becoming watchful and withdrawn, a child burdened with a sorrow she couldn't fully comprehend. They were grieving for a woman who was not dying, but was sitting in a prison cell hundreds of miles away, a truth that made their childhood grief a cruel fiction. The legacy of Richard's choice was not the preservation of their innocence, but the slow, corrosive decay of their trust. The lie, intended as a shield, became a prison that distorted their emotional development. The truth, when it finally came, was not delivered by their father, but deduced by his eldest daughter. In 1987, Jennifer Coleman, now a biology major at the University of Virginia, began to notice inconsistencies in the story she had been told for 6 years. The medical timeline her father had described for her mother's illness simply did not align with what she was learning in her textbooks. 6 years was an eternity in the world of aggressive cancer treatment. A patient would either be in remission or they would be gone. The long, silent stasis made no scientific sense. The phone call she made to her father in April of 1987 was the beginning of the end for the lie. She asked him a direct, devastating question, born from her own logical conclusion. When had Mom actually died? In her mind, the only explanation was that her mother had passed away years ago, and her father, in his grief, had been unable to tell them. The irony was profound. She had invented a second lie to make sense of the first one. Hearing his daughter's question, Richard knew the deception had run its course. Over a crackling phone line, the truth finally spilled out. The espionage, the arrest, the prison sentence. Jennifer's reaction was not rage or tears, but a long, unnerving silence. The foundation of her entire world had just been liquefied. The revelation cascaded through the family. Jennifer told Michael, who reacted with a cold, analytical fury. He demanded facts, dates, documents. The deception offended his engineer's mind. He needed to understand the mechanics of the lie, the sheer logistics of how it had been maintained. His confrontation with Richard was explosive. Sarah, now a teenager, received the news and retreated into a profound silence. Her grief redoubled. She was mourning not just the mother she had lost twice, once to a fake illness and once to a real crime, but also the father she now saw as a stranger, a man who had curated her entire emotional life based on a falsehood. The universal lesson of the Coleman story is a stark and painful one. A secret kept from those we love, even with the best of intentions, is a form of betrayal. Richard believed he was choosing the lesser of two evils, shielding his children from the trauma of their mother's treason. But what he failed to understand is that the truth, however brutal, allows for agency. It allows individuals to process, to adapt, to make their own choices about forgiveness and understanding. By denying them the truth, he denied them that agency. He infantilized them, assuming they were too fragile to handle reality. The lie itself became a more profound trauma than the one it was meant to conceal. The children's central wound wasn't that their mother was a spy. It was that their father, their ultimate protector and source of truth, had fundamentally deceived them about the nature of their world. He had tried to protect them from a fire, and in doing so had locked them in a smoke-filled room. This story resonates powerfully in our modern era. We live in an age of curated realities and digital deception, where state-sponsored disinformation campaigns and online radicalization can turn neighbors into enemies and blur the lines between domestic life and geopolitical conflict. The Coleman saga is a timeless analog parable for our digital age. It reminds us that ideological battles are not abstract contests between nations. They are fought by and have consequences for real human beings and their families. It serves as a potent warning that the desire to protect can curdle into a desire to control, and that the truth can be weaponized not just by our enemies, but by those closest to us. In June 1995, 14 years after they last saw her, the three Coleman children visited their mother in prison. In the sterile fluorescent-lit visiting room, they began the slow, arduous process of building a new relationship. One based not on the myth of the perfect mother or the fiction of a cancer patient, but on the complex, flawed reality of the woman who sat before them. Margaret, for her part, tried to explain her choices, speaking of manipulation and fear, of a slow, creeping entanglement that became impossible to escape. They visited her regularly after that, piecing together a fractured family in 30-minute increments. Richard Coleman never saw his wife again. He lived out his life in the same house, a monument to the family he had both saved and destroyed. He died in 2010. While sorting through his belongings, his children found a locked drawer in his study. Inside were nearly 200 letters from Margaret, written from prison over 2 decades. Letters he had read and saved, but had never shared. They were filled with remorse, with updates on her prison life, and with endless questions about the children he was raising. They were the silent, one-sided conversation between two people whose lives had been shattered by the same impossible circumstances. The story of Richard and Margaret Coleman has no easy heroes or villains. It is a tragedy in the truest sense of the word, a story of flawed people making impossible choices under immense pressure. Richard's actions can be seen simultaneously as acts of profound integrity and profound betrayal. He fulfilled his duty to his country, but in doing so he placed a burden on his children that would shape the rest of their lives. He believed he was choosing the path of least harm, but the legacy of his choice is a testament to the fact that in the shadow war of secrets and lies, there are no clean victories, and the deepest casualties are often the ones you were fighting to protect. The quiet suburban street was their battlefield, and the family home, their ground zero. And their story stands as a permanent, haunting reminder that the fallout from such conflicts can last for generations.